welcome back to the channel, guys, and welcome to Misha's Cafe in Alexandria. Today is one of my days off, and I'm just going to spend the day in Alexandria, where I'm staying. I think Alexandria is actually split into two parts. The western side of it, further away from the river, is the area that's not as nice compared to the eastern side, which is known as Old Town, which is closer to the Potomac River. It's a lot nicer. I'm just going to be spending most of my time on this side of Alexandria, and then I'm going to walk down to the Potomac River, check out the views there, and probably find a spot to run through one of my sessions from last week. Just going to chill here now and have my coffee and just try to wind down a bit, and then I'll head over to the river. Cheers. Right guys, so now I am currently at the waterfront, right beside the Potomac River, and also the bridge behind me, which connects Virginia to Maryland. Right, so this session that I want to go through was the session that I played last Friday. I'm definitely hoping to turn things around and see if I can remember how to win some pots and start stacking some chips. Right, so in this first hand, we are under the gun and we look down at pocket aces. It's looking like we're off to a good start here. So I make the standard open to $15. The action then unfortunately folds all the way to the small blind, who at least pays a little bit of respect and comes in for a call. And then the big blind also decides to make the call. So we are now going three ways to the flop, and the flop comes 3, 5, 6 rainbow. Not the ideal flop for our hand. The action's on the small blind, who quickly decides to check. The big blind checks, and now the action's on us. I think we can go either way here between betting and checking. I think generally speaking, I would lean more towards checking. This flop is not really the flop texture for the undergun raiser, and definitely smashes the blind's defending range. With this in mind, I think I do lean more towards checking rather than betting, and on this occasion I do decide to check back. So we are now off to a free turn card, and on the turn the dealer puts out an offsuit 9. The small blind decides to check twice, but now the big blind decides to lead out, although he does decide to choose quite a small sizing of just $20. I think facing this sizing, more often than not we do have the best hand. I think if big blind did choose a much larger sizing, it would put us in a much tougher spot. I think facing a large sizing, we would only have one option, which would be to call. Facing a small sizing, it does open up the possibility for us to come in for a raise. I think if we were playing against more tricky opponents, which at least in my perception versus these two opponents is not the case, then I would lean more towards raising, as if we do call, then we do open ourselves up to being in quite a tough spot if the small blind decides to raise. So given that I don't think either of our opponents in this hand are going to be that creative, I do lean towards just calling and seeing what the small blind decides to do. And the small blind, fortunately for us, doesn't decide to raise, he actually decides to make the fold. So we are now going heads up to the river card, and on the river the dealer puts out an offsuit 10. The action's on the big blind here, and I'm very curious to see what he does, as I think with this player type who plays quite solid, I think if Villain did decide to size up, I think more likely than not I think we would be beat. I think versus all small to medium sized bets, I think we'd always be calling. So after taking just a little bit of time to decide what to do, big blind does decide to lead out again, but he does decide to choose quite a small sizing of just $40. So in this spot, I think we can, of course, always raise here, but I think maybe more often than not, Villain does have a weak hand here, like a weak one pair hand, and maybe the occasional bluff. So in this case, I didn't raise, and I just decided to call the bet, and Villain tabled Queen 8 offsuit for a busted draw, leaving himself with just Queen high, and I then tabled my hand for the winner.
Twice I've been beat on aces, man.
Hey?
So this is the second time I'm being beat on aces. What the fuck?
In this next hand, the action folds to me in early position, and I look down at ace deuce of hearts. So I make the standard open to $15. The action then folds to a middle position player who makes the call, and then it continues folding all the way to the big blind, who also decides to come along for a call. So we are now going three ways to the flop, which comes ace 6-10 with 2 spades. The big blind checks, and now the action's on us. So this is quite an interesting flop for our hand, because although we do flop top pair, we don't really have a kicker, and we don't really have many opportunities to improve on later streets. I think we can go either way here between betting and checking. Checking is not really a bad option here, as our hand is unlikely going to want to play a big pot, especially on this flop texture. If we do bet, then I think we want to be choosing a small sizing here, not mainly because of the value of our hand, but also because we are still multi-way. On this occasion, I did decide to continue betting, and I decided to bet $15. The middle position quickly decides to make the call, and the big blind also decides to come along for a call. So we are now still going 3 ways to the turn card. The dealer puts out an offsuit deuce, which is obviously a great card for our hand. The big blind decides to check twice, and the action's now back on us. Given that we've managed to hit one of the very few cards that does improve our hand, on this occasion we definitely want to continue double barreling. Looking at the size of the pot, I decide to size up and double barrel for $70. The middle position player now goes into the tank, and after a little while he eventually decides to make the call. The big blind quickly decides to fold, so we are now going heads up to the river card. Going into the river card, given that I've sized up on the turn, I feel like I've narrowed Rillin's range now to strong ace-x hands and pair plus flush draw type hands. And given that this deuce has now brought in a second flush draw, there's definitely a lot of cards that can fall on the river here that's going to hurt and decrease the value of our hand. On the river, the dealer, unfortunately for us, puts out the king of spades, which now completes the gut shot straight draw and also the front door flush. Our hand now loses a lot of value, which basically means there aren't very many hands now which are worse than ours, which are going to be calling many river bets. So unfortunately for us, I think this hand only has one option on the river card, which is to check. I think our hand is relatively face up. I think we don't really have very many nutted hands in this spot. I think we most likely have a hand that has good showdown value. But having said that, on the other hand, I equally don't put villain on the type of player to be bluffing very often here, and especially not so when he decides to assemble quite a lot of chips here, and he decides to fire out of this river for $375. In game, it felt very value heavy to me. Of course, I could be wrong, but I think most of the case here, especially for this player type, for the read that I have, he's pretty much always going to have a very strong hand here. It sucks that we managed to hit such a great turn card here, but unfortunately, we've also seen a very bad river card. I don't really like this river card, don't really like the sizing of this river bet as well. Didn't spend too long here before making the relatively easy fold. Right, in this next interesting hand, the action folds all the way to the hijack, and he decides to open for $20. The cutoff on his left decides to make the call, and then I look down on the button with Jack-9 of diamonds. In this spot, I think it's okay to 3-bet or call. In this case, I decide to continue with just a flat call. The small blind and big blind make the fold, so we are now going 3 ways to the flop. And on the flop, it comes pretty decent. It comes Jack 8-7 rainbow. So we flop ourselves top pair with an inside gut shot for the straight. The hijack decides to start with the check, and then the cutoff decides to take over the betting lead by betting $25. Now in this spot, I think we only really have one option here. Folding is of course out of the question, and I don't really like raising, as I think we would be over-wrapping our hand here. I think if we do decide to raise, I think it would be much better to choose much stronger or much weaker hands here. Therefore, for our exact hand, I think the best way to continue, it would be to just call. So that's what I decide to do. I decide to make the call, and then the hijack folds. So we are now going heads up to the turn card, and on the turn, the dealer puts out an offsuit 5. Action's on the cutoff here, who thinks for a little while before deciding to put in a double barrel. But he decides to put out another small sizing of just $35. Facing this sizing in game, it did feel quite milky to me. I think villain here could quite easily have some Jack-X hands. Even though we do have a Jack, we have quite a weak kicker. So if villain did have a Jack-X, it's going to be stronger than ours. So with this in mind, I did decide to continue with just a flat call. We are now off to the river card here, and on the river, the dealer puts out an offsuit 3. And here on the river card, I'm hoping for villain to play a check, as if he does decide to check, then I think more often than not we have the best hand. But unfortunately for us, villain does decide to continue firing here, although he does decide to choose yet again another annoying sizing of $40. Facing this bet, I think it's unlikely that villain does have a hand that we beat here. If we were raising here, which we obviously would be doing as just a bluff, I think I would rather choose a much weaker hand here rather than a hand such as top pair. So as annoying as it is, I don't really think we have too much option here. So I decide to flick in the call, and villain, unfortunately for us, tables King Jack offsuit. for a top pair with a stronger kicker. Sucks that we lost the hand, but I think this hand was pretty standard, and unfortunately it just didn't work out for us in this case.
9 diamonds, the one I noticed it on.
After playing quite a lot of small to medium-sized pots, we now come on to one of the biggest hands that we played in that session. In this hand, there is an open from under the gun to $15. There is then 5 callers behind him before the small blind then folds to me in the big blind, and I look down at pocket aces. Of course, we are going to be putting in the 3-bet here. Just looking at how many callers there are behind me, I eventually decide to settle on a sizing of $140. The action is now on the under the gun player, who is someone who I've tagged as a pretty solid ABC player. I think given this player type and my raise sizing, and also because I've 3-bet from the big blind, I think would significantly narrow his continuing range here. So if he does decide to call, then not only obviously because I've got aces, I think it would also be very easy for me to navigate the hand, given that I've got a pretty good solid read on this player and the most likely type of hands that he's going to be playing. So after thinking it through, the under the gun player eventually settles on a call. At this point, I'm really hoping with the sizing that I've chosen that it's not going to have a domino effect and see like 2 or 3 more callers behind me, as I wouldn't be so keen playing this hand out of position versus 2 or 3 players. Unfortunately for me, my nightmare didn't come to fruition. The rest of the players make the fold, so we're now in the perfect scenario where we are going heads up to the flop. So as I've mentioned, I'm ranging my opponent from under the gun on quite a narrow range here, such as maybe kings, most likely ace king, queens, or maybe even jacks. With this in mind, we are now going to the flop, and on the flop, the dealer puts out 6-5-3 rainbow, which is the perfect flop for our hand. I have the effective stack here of about 1k to start the hand, and I think in this spot we are generally always going to be sizing down here for a c-bet. I think we can quite easily get stacks in, choosing small bets and firing on all 3 streets. So I do decide to size down and bet $125. The under the gun then takes a little bit of time before deciding to continue with a call. So we are now off to the turn card, and on the turn the dealer puts out an offsuit 4, which now puts 4 to a straight. It's not so great because it now gives villain some additional outs for a chop. I think it's very unlikely that this card should ever slow down the action, as neither player in this hand should really ever have a deuce or a 7 in our hand here. So with this in mind, this turn card is a brick, so therefore I am going to continue barreling. And again, I think we want to continue choosing relatively small sizing here, given our stack to pot ratio is going to be close to 1-to-1 by the river card. So after taking a little bit of time to consider my options, I eventually settle on a bet size of $250. The villain from under the gun now decides to pause for a little while before taking a look at my stack. I think he's just trying to decide if he wants to put me all in now or maybe make the fold. And after thinking it through for a little while, villain decides to jam the rest of his stack in. So of course, given our exact hand, we are always going to be snap calling, and we are now off to the river card. And on the river, I'm obviously just praying not to see any deuces or 7s. Fortunately for us, the dealer puts out another 6, and then villain from under the gun announces ace high, so I then table my hand for the winner. Villain did actually table his hand here for ace king offsuit, which is no good, so we now get to win our first stack of the session. In this hand, there is an open from under the gun to $15. The action then folds all the way to me in the hijack, and I look down at ace 10 of spades. So with this hand, I think we can mix between 3-betting and calling. I think calling would be the higher frequency and more standard play, and that's what we decide to do in this case. We decide to continue with a flat call. The cutoff folds, the button calls, and both the small blind and big blind fold. We are now going 3 ways to the flop, which comes king, queen, 8 with 2 diamonds. So we flop ourselves a gut shot to the nuts. Under the gun checks, so I decide to also play a check, but now the button, to my surprise, decides to put out a bet, and he decides to put out a bet of $25. The under the gun player decides to make the call, and the action is now back on us. I did consider my options here between calling and raising. I think there's 2 reasons why I would lean more towards calling rather than raising. I think raising would be bad here because we would narrow our opponent's range to hands that have us in pretty bad shape, like a pair plus flush draw type hands like king x of diamonds. And also for my second reason, I don't think we would be repping that much really, given we only just flattered an under the gun opener. If we did have a strong hand, the only hand that we'd only be repping here would be king queen offsuit and the very occasional pocket 8s. And more likely than not, we're going to be having a draw here. So for this reason, I like to keep my range a little bit wider here. So in this case, I did decide to continue with a just call. We are now off to the turn card, and on the turn, the dealer puts out an offsuit jack. which is of course absolute gin for us. The under the gun checks, and I also decide to continue checking to the button, and the button decides to continue to bet twice, and he decides to bet out for $50. Facing the $50 bet, the under the gun player now decides to go into the tank, and right now I'm obviously praying for the villain to obviously come in for a big check raise if he has slow played maybe a hand like kings or queens, or maybe a hand like king queen. But after thinking it through for a little while, the under the gun player, unfortunately for us, decides to make the fold, so the action is now on us. So in this spot, given we've hit the nuts, is obviously a no-brainer that we're going to be coming in for a check raise here. I've seen this player play a few hands in my session already, and my read on this player type is that when he's bet at least twice consecutively on quite a relatively wet board, he generally only does so with quite strong hands. So therefore, in terms of sizing, especially as villain still has about $700 to $800 left in his stack, I think we want to go for a slightly larger sizing here. I think at least a 4x sizing I think will probably be best. Therefore, in this case, I decided to go for a little larger than a 4x sizing of $225. I think by choosing this sizing, we're going to be leaving villain with about a 1-to-1 stack to pot ratio by the river, so we can quite comfortably get stacks in quite easily on safe river cards. Facing this big check raise, villain now decides to go into the tank, and after thinking it through for a little while, villain eventually decides to continue with a call. We are now going to the river card, and there's quite a lot of river cards that we're looking to fade here. And on the river, the dealer puts out the 5 of hearts, which is one of the most beautiful river cards in the deck, as we are now still holding the nuts. After taking maybe like 15 seconds or so, I decide to jam the rest of my stack in and just pray that villain has a 2-pair type hand to pay us off. But unfortunately for us, villain makes the snap fold, which in my mind I think just means he had a big combo draw which missed. Fortunately for us, we didn't get unlucky and villain didn't suck out on us, so we get to drag in this nice medium-sized pot and continue to build our stack. So in this next interesting hand, the action folds all the way to the low jack, who decides to limp in for $5. I am then next to act in the hijack, and I look down at king 9 of clubs. So I decide to put in a raise to $20. The cutoff then folds, the button calls, the small blind folds, the big blind calls, and then the low jack, who was the original limper in this hand, also decides to come along for a call. So we are now going 4 ways to the flop here, which comes 7, 9, 4 with 1 club. So all in all, a pretty decent flop for our hand. The action quickly checks to me, and I think a hand like king 9 of clubs wants to be betting this flop at a very high frequency here. So I think the question here is just on sizing. Given that there is a club on this flop, I think I do like sizing up just a little bit here. Therefore, I decide to choose a sizing of $35. The button decides to make the call. However, the other 2 players in the hand decide to make the fold. Button in his hand is playing relatively short stacked. I think he started the hand with just about $300 or so, and this is going to be an important factor as we continue on the turn. So we are now off to a turn card, and on the turn the dealer puts out an offsuit 3, which now completes 5-6 for the straight. Action's on me, and I think in this spot we can go either way here between checking and betting. So even though I do believe that betting would be the higher frequency play here, on this occasion I did decide to check back. The action is now on the button, who goes into the tank, and after taking just a little bit of time, he does decide to continue betting for $60. Don't really know how to describe it, but I just felt that villain was actually really comfortable with his hand. So I think from a theoretical standpoint, we should be jamming in this situation. However, given my specific play read in this hand, I decided to proceed a little bit more cautiously and just continue with a check call. And we are now off to a river card. On the river, the dealer puts out an offsuit queen, which is pretty much a brick. Given the line I've taken, I think checking would make the most sense, and that's what I decided to do. I decided to play a check. Villain now quickly decides to jam the rest of his stack in for like just over $200, and already I'm not really liking this situation. I think if villain did decide to check back on the river, I think we would almost always win here. But given that villain's decided to jam the river, it does put us in quite a tough spot, as I think now villain has now turned our hands into just a bluff catch, as I think it's very unlikely that villain would be doing this with worse 9x hands. I think the only 9x hand which would make sense would be a hand like queen 9. Villain is now repping a hand that beats us, so 2-pair plus or even sets. It's very exploitative, but I really did feel in game that I was beat already on the turn. Theoretically, I know this is quite ridiculous. We should pretty much always have the best hand here, but I went with my read here, and I felt that more likely than not we would beat. So it does seem quite nitty, but I decided to go for my read, and so I decided to make the side fold. So villain is going to be dragging in this pot. Right, and now we come on to the final hand that we played in our session last week. In this hand, the action folds to me in the low jack, and I look down at Queen 10 of clubs. So I make the standard open to $15. The action then folds all the way to the small blind, who puts in a 3-bet to $55. So it's quite a small 3-bet, given that we're both almost $2,000 deep. The big blind folds, and now the action's back on us. So in this spot, I think we just have a pretty clear call here. So that's what I decide to do. I decide to make the flat call. So we are now going heads up to the flop. And on the flop, the dealer puts out 7-8 queen with 2 diamonds. Action is now on the small blind, who decides to put out a small c-bet of $30. When we're facing quite a small c-bet sizing, it just means that we should be incorporating some raises as the in-position player in 3-bet pots. So even though in hindsight I think I would have preferred raising, in this case I did decide to continue with just a flat call. We are now off to the turn card, and on the turn the dealer puts out an offsuit 10, which is obviously a great card for us. Small blind now continues to check, and the action is now on us. When villain decides to 3-bet for a relatively small sizing, a c-bet for a small sizing. I'm not putting villain on much strength here, so basically a hand with showdown value, but not a hand like ace queen plus. So I think from a theoretical standpoint, my hand wants to bet for a very large sizing here, maybe like an overbet. On this specific occasion, I wanted to increase the likelihood of me getting my bet called, and therefore I didn't want to go for a large overbet. So in this case, I decided to bet just $75. Villain now goes into the tank to consider his options, and after thinking it through, he eventually settles on a call. We are now off to the river card, and on the river the dealer puts out the 3 of diamonds, which now completes the front door flush. Villain decides to now snap check the river, and the action is now back on us. The other challenge that we have with this hand is that we pretty much have 0 bluffs that's going to be taking this line and betting the river. So in my opinion, I think this all adds up to a small river bet. I think I want to be going for a quarter to a third pot type sizing. So after doing a little bit of calculation in my head, I decide to fire out of the river for $90. Facing this small bet, villain doesn't snap fold and instead decides to take a little bit of time to decide what to do. But after taking a little bit of time, villain, unfortunately for us, decides to make the good fold. So we get to drag in this last pot of our session. So that now concludes all the interesting hands from my session last week. Good news for me, we managed to book a relatively decent profit of $1,629. As a summary for the week, I managed to book my very first winning week of $3,807. Fingers crossed we can now continue this uptrend and get ourselves unstuck and out of the hole. See you guys next time. Peace.